Good evening and welcome to Q&A, live from the Theberton Theatre in Adelaide. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, former UN Senior Advisor Andrew Macleod, who negotiated with the Taliban in Pakistan, the Shadow Minister for Education, Kate Ellis, French Ambassador to Australia, Christophe Lecourtier, young entrepreneur Holly Ransom, the Minister for Industry and Innovation, Christopher Pyne, and Independent Senator Nick Xenophon. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, in the aftermath of the terror attacks in Paris, we've made some late changes to our panel, as you've seen. On behalf of us all, I'd like to offer an especially warm welcome to the French Ambassador, Christophe Lecourtier. Thanks for being here. Our first question tonight comes from Nick Carvelis.
Ambassador Lecourtier, why do you think the terrorists targeted particular venues and those cohorts of Parisians on the weekend?
Thank you so much for your question. Let me first tell you how it's important for me to be with you tonight. I've had 2 terrible days and nights since last Saturday, so it's my first, I would call it, warm evening with you. Imagine that what has happened in Paris 2 days ago was exactly, a kind of evening like this one, a Friday evening. People, having dinner or enjoying music or enjoying a sport event, and suddenly, randomly, cowardly, in cold blood, gunners come and kill 132 people. So that's what has happened in my city, the place where I was raised, where I spent most of my life. So your question is, why this has happened? Well, it has happened because it's a war. I wouldn't like to be, so rude probably with you tonight by saying that, but it's a war because the values that we share, the values that we've been sharing with the Australians probably since the First World War are at stake. There are some people who do not accept our way of life, that do think that death is far more important than life and the kind of life we enjoy. And because we disagree with them, because we've tried to resist what they are doing to us, now they're killing our citizens. They're killing my friends, they're killing my parents, my relatives in the cities of my country.
And targeting what in secular France they consider to be decadent, but which is built into the French way of life, to our way of life.
It has taken centuries probably for us to build our way of life. I know that so many Australians enjoy traveling to France. More than 1 million Australians every year visit France. You know that there is a special connection because of the Great War between us. But more than that, we share the same values. It means that we want to be able to go out with anybody, to dress as we want, to be in love with any people we want, we love. So that's the kind of things these people do not accept. And until the very last moment, you can be sure that France will resist that, and we shall never retreat 1 millimeter from our values.
I'm going to go straight to our next questioner. Thank you. Go straight to our next questioner. It's Terry Houghton.
Bonsoir, Ambassador and panellists. On Saturday, my wife Julie and I received a message from a French friend responding to the terrifying Paris attacks. It read, in part, "All are okay, worst attack ever. They say things will change now, from now. Very sad, dark chapter starting." Now, panellists, given what the Ambassador has just said, where to from here? Ever tighter security controls or more sophisticated strategies firmly anchored on a strong understanding of the social causes of terrorism?
Let's start with Andrew Macleod, and I'll bring you back in a moment, Ambassador. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Let me start off by saying to Christophe, nous sommes tous Parisiens ce soir, and we're all with you ce soir.
Merci beaucoup.
There are two things to say very quickly. The first one is, these are now the times to be thoughtful, not emotional. It's not the time for slogans, and to that extent, I'm very happy that we're now being led by Mr. Turnbull rather than Mr. Abbott, because it is the thoughtful leadership.
Okay,
It's thoughtful
it's
leadership.
also not a time for partisanship.
No, it's
so we'll
not,
move
but
on
I'm
to
not
that. Okay.
partisan. What
I'm talking to the audience now.
What I do need to say, though, is, and Christophe has said this a couple of times, we are in war. They attacked us. But what we need from our national leadership now is to determine who is the them and who is the us. And there are two broad choices. It is us Westerners against them, all of Islam, or is it us moderates of all religions against them, radicals of all religions. And we have organisations in this country, like Reclaim Australia, who really are falling into the trap of Islamic State, who are trying to create the us Westerners against them, all of Islam. If we fall into that trap, we're saying we want to fight with 1.6 billion people. Whereas if we define the us as all moderates of all religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, against radicals of all religions, it's a much smaller number to fight and a much more effective number to fight. So what we've got to do at the beginning, Terry, to come to your question, we need to make sure as a country the us is moderates of all religions against them, the radicals of all religions.
Christopher Pyne, let's bring you in.
Well, first of all, Tony, I think it's wonderful that Christophe has joined the panel tonight, and I've been listening to him on the radio over the last few days, and I've been incredibly impressed with his courage and strength of purpose and in representing the French government's view here in Australia. Fortunately, every Australian could be under no illusion about France's position. In terms of Terry's question, the very important thing is that we don't allow people to change our way of life. That the terrorists and the extremists want us to change the way we live. We are a very sophisticated, successful liberal democracy, and we have to make sure that when this process is all finished, when this is over, and it will be over at some point, we are still a sophisticated, liberal, open democracy. That's the most important priority. How do we achieve that end? Well, we have to achieve it in a number of ways. We achieve it by continuing with our current way of life. And we achieve it by militarily defeating ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That is a necessary foundation for being able to go on with our way of life. But we achieve it too by not allowing ISIS to do what they want to do, which Andrew alluded to, which is turning Australian against Australian or European against European. So we mustn't allow extremist militant Islamists to represent the Islamic faith. Moderate Muslims need to be embraced in Australia or elsewhere. Moderate Muslim governments need to be embraced wherever they might be, because they have as much at stake as we do in defeating the extremists.
Kate Ellis.
Well, first of all, I would join with the other panellists in passing on my thoughts and my condolences to the Ambassador, to the people of France. The question, where to from here, I believe that now absolutely has to be a time for cool and calm heads. And that means that our leaders need to all step up and be putting forward messages of unity and the importance of it. And I don't just talk about political leaders, I think all leaders across our community. I mean, I for one cannot for a moment comprehend why Pauline Hanson was on our television over the weekend speaking about these events and about Muslim Australians. We need And I guess in the spirit I've just spoken about, I agree with everything that Christopher just said on this issue. This is a time when, of course, we need to make sure that we have safeguards and security provisions in place, but we also have to make sure that we make very clear to everyone that moderate Muslims are our closest ally, and they must be our closest ally in this fight.
Nick Xenophon.
Well, firstly, we need to embrace the moderates. This can't be about against Islam, it's about moderates against extremists. But let's put this in perspective. ISIS did not exist before March 2003, before the American invasion of Iraq. As bad as Saddam Hussein was, and he was a brutal dictator, the US, in a botched strategy, a muddle-headed strategy, made a mess of things, and it spawned sectarian violence. We have to avoid the mistakes of the past. We must deal with the existential threat that ISIS is to the West. But we must acknowledge that we cannot bomb our way out of this. We must acknowledge that if we have indiscriminate... Because what happened in Iraq was a bloody mess. We have to learn from that, and unless we learn from it, we're destined to repeat the same mistakes.
Nick, there'll be more on that particular subject coming up. I've seen some of the questions which canvass those issues. Holly Ransom, what do you think?
I think a lot of what the panel has been said, and Christophe, I'd like to echo my sympathies to yourself and all the Parisians out there. I think we do pray for Paris, and very much that unity that we've seen in that demonstration and outpouring of love and hope is something we need to continue to send to that part of the world and to others. I think, to your point, we do need to better understand who it is that we're fighting. I think we've made some mistakes in how the strategy has been played out. So in part, I think you're right that it needs to be smarter strategies. In part, we need leaders to be more careful with the way that we use language. And in part, we need to understand that this is a really complex and challenging issue. You know, as Christopher alluded to, it's not just going to be able to be a military strategy that will solve this problem. We do need to approach that part of it. We know part of ISIS's legitimacy is its hold on territory, and that needs to be dealt with. Part of it is a political solution. So how do we ensure stability back into that region, enable governance, restore a nation that is war-torn? And in part, as well, to Kate's point, I think it is about community leadership. You know, terrorism cannot proliferate where social cohesion is strong. And that's part of the solution that each and every single one of us can play a role in how do we ensure that tolerance, unity, that multiculturalism is something that we are living and we're demonstrating day in, day out.
Christophe, I'll bring you back in. There are 5 million Muslims living in France. A very tiny percentage of them have been radicalised. Some of them have taken part in these terrible events. What happens if you go too far in your measures at home?
No, this is indeed a very important issue for a country like France, and it's probably the same in Britain. Roughly 9 to 10% of the population now is Muslim. It's a very important community, but of course, 96, 97, 98% of them are good people, and probably we've not done enough in the past 20 years to bring them fully into the nation. When I look at Australia, I do see that you've been, behaving and working far better than us in the previous 20 years to bring new immigrants into your communities, and in that sense, Australia is a true model. So we have to work on that, and for instance, if I can make a confidence to you, I have myself adopted a Muslim boy. He was 19 years old at the time, and I try to do my best to give him the chance to become a true French citizen. And now what he wants to become? An Australian.
I'm not going to say whether that's a wise choice or not. Let's go to our next question. It's from Mohammed Al-Kafaji.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to send my sympathies and condolences to you, Ambassador, and the people of France. And as a young Australian Muslim, that really means a lot, and I'm really sorry about what happened. I came to Australia in 2003 as an Iraqi refugee, and having also lived in Syria myself, I'm very grateful for the opportunities that I've had here in Australia, and that I'm determined to give back to the community that welcomed me here. To the rest of the panel, every time there is a terrorist attack, I and my community have been called upon to condemn and explain ourselves as Muslims about why and how this happened. When do people realize that this has nothing to do with any religion, and when can we move forward?
Andrew Macleod, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Mohammed. I'm going to pick you up on a little bit. It's all very nice for us to say this has nothing to do with religion, but that's not quite true. Religion is used as a motivator for people. And in fact, you can take parts of the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran, and take these provisions, and they can be used to inspire all sorts of hatred. And across the centuries, different parts of different religions have done so. What we see in this century, because of the impact of information technology, a vast spread of communication, is the distorted message of the religious text is passed to a lot more people and a lot faster. So religion is used as a motivator, but are these people true Muslims? I don't think so. In the same way that a pedophile priest has done such a heinous act that it takes him outside of the spectrum of Christianity, in my view. I don't care how much a pedophile priest tells me he's a Christian, his actions prove to me he's not. And I don't care how much a terrorist proclaims Allahu Akbar, he's not a Muslim by the very actions that he's undertaking. But we need to be aware that religion is being used as a motivator. And that's part of what I was talking about earlier, about setting up the world of who is the us and who is the them. And our language and our words now have to be very, very important. If we want us to be all moderates against all radicals, consider this. When the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened back in January, the tragedy in Paris, 12 journalists were killed. In response, we, the West, a number of world leaders and hundreds of thousands of people protesting up and down the streets in Paris for an objection to the murder, but also demanding the right to free speech and demanding the right to offend. Everybody recognised those cartoons were offensive. Yet a few weeks earlier, 132 children and 9 teachers, including a friend of mine, were butchered in a school in Peshawar in Pakistan because the children had committed the sin of being the children of military officers who are fighting the radicals that we too are also fighting. Yet we said almost nothing. So what is the signal that we're sending to moderate Islam? We will protest loudly for the right to offend you, but we'll be silent when your children die. Is this the way that we create a collaborative partnership with moderate Islam? And you want to know something? I really don't like the term moderate Islam. I would prefer to say real Muslims. There are extremists and there are real Muslims. Moderate Islam are just like all of us, normal, everyday people that follow the God of Abraham, like Jews, like Christians, like Muslims. But the terrorists have stepped so far out of that, I don't think it's valid to call them Muslims. I don't think it's valid to say they're religious. But we do need to recognise, Mohammed, that religion is used as a motivator.
Can I just go back to Mohammed? Do you want to... Would you like to respond to that analysis?
Sure. I mean, we see in the media all the time that people say Muslims in the community haven't come out and haven't denounced this, but yet they selectively choose what to hear and what not to hear. And I'm constantly in a bit of a battle of saying, how do we come as a community to move forward on this issue? How do we bring together people from all walks of life and actually understand and sit down and talk to each other and learn from each other?
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Christopher Pyne here. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said yesterday the tragedy for Islam in a speech that was widely said to be quite moderate, actually, compared to Team Australia kind of ideas from earlier. The tragedy for Islam is that people who are doing these horrible, evil things claim to be doing it in the name of God, in the name of Islam. Is that something that has to be recognised?
Well, I think Andrew's dealt with that to a large extent. I mean, people who are claiming to be doing things in the name of religion can do so whether it's Islam in past, Christianity, whatever particular religion is at that time behaving in an extreme way. It doesn't mean that they're actually acting like Muslims. And because they use that, we should be very careful not to fall into the trap of them pushing us into the corner that they want us to be in, to then turn against them within our own communities. Now, Andrew mentions the massacre in Peshawar, but only in the last week, I think over 40 to 50 people were killed in Beirut, which is a very moderate, sophisticated city in the middle of the Middle East, and we didn't say enough about that at the time. I remember thinking at the time, we should say something about that, but of course we didn't know what was going to happen in Paris on the weekend. And now in hindsight, of course, the point that you make, And the point that Muhammad makes, brings home that we must say things when those things happen. Before I just hand the microphone back to you, though, Tony, the Muslim communities do come out and condemn these acts when they occur. They shouldn't be called on to do so because it suggests that they didn't want to do it. I agree with Muhammad. I've never known one of these things to happen where Muslim leaders in Australia didn't come out and condemn them. But by the very act of demanding that they come out, you suggest that they didn't want to. And I think that is something we must stop happening in Australia. Whoever is doing that must stop it, because it is a pejorative demand. I don't know any Muslims in my community who would think that the acts in Paris or in Lebanon or anywhere else were reasonable. And their leadership should react exactly the same way as everyone else's leadership, which is to be horrified and aghast by it.
Christopher, you'd agree, though, that when Prime Minister Abbott said, "I wish Islamic leaders, when they condemned terrorism, really meant it," that wasn't helpful, was it?
Well, I'm not going to be partisan and political, Nick. I mean,
no, you're not.
I think
okay. But that wasn't helpful, and I think the Prime Minister Turnbull's language is much more reasonable. It's nuanced.
Malcolm said on the weekend that there needed to be a political solution in Syria. I think that's a statement of the obvious. We have to have a military solution in order to reach a political solution. But in the light of what happened on the weekend, I'm not going to be partisan or political about these events.
No, but I think it's important to say that I agree with you. We need to embrace real Muslims, moderates, or however you want to describe them, because that is the solution to this. And that's why the Grand Mufti of Australia, who I know, Professor Ibrahim Abu Muhammad, was unequivocal in his condemnation and expressing his condolences and grief for what occurred in France. And that's Australia's Islamic leader. I think it's very encouraging.
Okay, we're going to move on to some other questions. Just briefly before we do that, Andrew, you mentioned those school children slaughtered in Peshawar in the military school, and of course the Taliban killers justified what they were doing by saying those children went immediately to heaven because the last thing they heard was Allah Akbar.
This is something we need to understand. A lot of people say terrorists are crazy, insane, stupid. Actually, they're not. I'm going to say something that might offend one or two people, and I apologise. I'm going to overgeneralise now the Abrahamic religions, and I know it's an overgeneralisation, so please don't tweet the heck out of me. If you believe in God, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, and you believe in heaven, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, and you believe there is a certain code of conduct you need to follow that gets you into heaven, and lots of Jews, Christians and Muslims do, then it's logical to follow that code of conduct. It's not crazy, it's logical. So the question now comes is, who taught you what code of conduct? What are you following? You learned yours in your schools. People learnt theirs in their schools, which is why the challenge in countries like Syria and the challenge with radical Islam is a multi-generational challenge, because there are people in that community who have been taught, in my view wrongly, that the code of conduct to get into heaven is to do this sort of thing. There is a rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, who's written a book, In God's Name, not in God's Name. And if you want to understand this dynamic, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, because he talks about a thing called dualism, which is creating the us versus them fight. And once you create the us versus them fight, it's very, very easy to be destructive of other human beings. And then he says you move from there to a thing called altruistic evil. Because you're not doing this bad thing for yourself, you're doing what God commands you to do. It's now not evil, it's altruistic. It's following the teachings of God. Altruistic evil and dualism, us versus them. And we've got to be very careful. They're not crazy. They're following a logical path based on an educational framework that I just happen to think is grossly wrong.
Christophe, is that something the French government is going to have to counter in this tiny group of people that we're talking about, and how do you do it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that we shall need to do in the coming weeks anyway. There's the risk also of radicalization of our own political life, because as you know, there is a populist party that is growing in the far right that probably is around 30-35% now. Marine Le Pen. So this is not only something French, it's also happening in other countries in Europe. So probably it's evil against evil, and that's what the terrorists are looking for, to radicalize the country, to organize a kind of, struggle between different communities of this country. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and needs to be done right now. Yeah.
Let's move on to our next question. It's from Diana Piantadosi.
Apparently, one of the attackers who carried out the atrocities in Paris posed as a refugee to gain asylum in Greece. While I know circumstances like this are extremely rare, exactly how are we selecting the 12,000 Syrian refugees Australia will be offering permanent protection visas to? The former PM Tony Abbott said we would be offering asylum to those most in need of protection, women, children, and families from persecuted minorities. But my understanding is the most persecuted minority embroiled in this crisis is actually gay men who are actively hunted and meet especially brutal ends. So exactly how are we determining who is most in need of our help, and how is the government making sure no one ill-intentioned will slip through the cracks?
Holly, you're not here representing the government, but I want to hear you on that question first, because there's obviously going to be, in some parts of the community, and Christophe just alluded to it in France, a kind of backlash now against bringing refugees from Syria into various countries.
Yeah, there will be, and I think the point was made in Diana's question, though, that this is an extreme minority, and I think it's really important that when we look at this issue, we don't conflate the humanitarian crisis with our response to dealing with an extremist group. I mean, we've got to be mindful that the people who are fleeing persecution, who are leaving, seeking security, seeking refuge, are the same people who are, they're fleeing the same people that perpetrated the attacks on the weekend. And so it's really important, I think, first and foremost, that we do continue to provide that. Now, if we need to add additional layers to our process, it's important we keep an eye to national security without a doubt in how we go about doing this. But I think we shouldn't waver whatsoever from our commitment that we've made to take 12,000 refugees.
Kate Ellis.
Well, I think we need to have a look at the extent of the crisis in Syria. We're talking about, at last count, 11 million displaced Syrians. We, in Australia, are talking about bringing in 12,000. Now, we have, and we should, of course, make sure that we do background checks, make sure that we have our security arrangements in place. But we can go through a process and find 12,000 people out of 11 million displaced Syrians, and we should do that. We should also remember that when we're talking about us v them, it was Muslims who were the first victims of Islamic State. It was the people of Syria and the people of northern Iraq, and there are now millions of them displaced, and Australia is big enough and smart enough to find a way that we can do that safely. And I don't for a moment try and discount people's concerns. I absolutely get that there are people that are scared, people that want to know that we have precautions in place. We should make sure that we have our intelligence agencies have the capacity and the resources that they need to do this properly. But then we should absolutely do it, and we should do more.
Christopher Pyne, we'll go back to the core part of the question, which was how are the 12,000 going to be chosen? And is there any even hint that Muslims will be excluded from that, and particularly Muslim men?
Well, I think I agree with most of what Kate said. I would only add to that it's 12,000 in addition to the usual about 14,500 plus humanitarian visas that we issue each year. So it's 26,000 plus this coming 12 months. And I agree with Kate that I'm sure it's not beyond our wit to run a very serious filter over everyone coming to Australia. We have been doing that for decades, and we're pretty good at it. And I'm very confident that we will find the right people. There are no end of minorities in Syria wanting to get out, whether they are gay men, whether they're Melkites, Antiochians, Maronites, every kind of Christian minority has been horrifically persecuted. Druze in some parts of Syria, of course, Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims are in some parts of Syria minorities who are being persecuted by each other as well. So there's no end of people campaigning to be the most persecuted minority in Syria, and I'm very confident that we will find 12,000 people, and I'm sure the government of Malcolm Turnbull will continue to monitor what we can do. and how much more we can do over the course of the coming years, because this will not be a matter that's resolved in the next 6 to 12 months. The Prime Minister of France was saying today that they expect more attacks, maybe in the next few days, few weeks or few months, that the French intelligence services expected attacks to occur. It is a very complex situation, and Australia, as a sophisticated, wealthy, first world developed country, has a responsibility to play at least our part to ensure that we do what's necessary to help the people who are in need.
Okay, we'll go to a related question. It's from Mazia Mohammadi.
Good evening. First of all, please allow me to express my heartfelt condolence to the people of France and to the ambassador. My name is Mazia Mohammadi. I'm a former refugee from Afghanistan. I was born to the Hazara ethnic minority who have a long history of persecution and continue to be the prime target of the insurgents in Afghanistan. In fact, as we speak of the attacks in France, only 3 days before that, Hazara men, women and children were beheaded in the worst possible manner by the very same brand of terror. And similar atrocities had my father flee Afghanistan 15 years ago to arrive in Australia by boat. I find it really heartbreaking to realize that the attacks in France are actually translating to active demonization and opposition of refugees here at home and beyond. So my question is, while political mantras like close the border and tighten Australia's refugee policy are being advocated, how do we ensure that the focus is not actually shifted from finding real solutions, solid solutions to tackling global terrorism to that of victimization of a particular group of people who are vulnerable, desperate, and running for their lives for the same acts of terror and threats?
I'll start with Nick Xenophon.
It's a terrific question. Taking 12,000 refugees from Syria is the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. We're a big country with a big heart. But there are 12 million displaced people, as Kate said. It highlights the need for a political solution. What we've been doing to date has not been working. We've actually seems to have strengthened ISIS and strengthened the terrorists. We need to have a different approach. I was reading today a 2004 Pentagon report, US Department of Defense, where they actually said that their approach in dealing with the threat of extremists has been, to date, back in 2004, counterproductive. They said it's had the opposite of the effect intended. I don't know what Andrew thinks about that as an expert, whether he thinks it still applies. But the issue is this, I think the definition of insanity, as Einstein said, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We need to do something different.
Yep. Christoph, can I bring you in? And I'll take you back to the previous question as well, which mentioned the passport, the Syrian passport that was found near the body of one of the suicide bombers, and which, of course, has begun a debate about the refugees coming into Europe, flooding into Europe. The close the borders thing is going to get bigger in Europe by the sound of it.
Probably, but it's always easy to caricature things and more difficult to analyze precisely what's happening. Since I arrived in this country, I've received a lot of advisors from senior ministers. I'm not talking about you, Christopher Pine, saying, why aren't you able to stop the boats? But you just have to look at what is the geography and also the geopolitical of Europe. And it's not something you can do like that, first of all. Second thing is that Europe has always been a balance between generosity. A lot of immigrants have also come to Europe, of course to Australia, and they did pretty well, but also to Europe in the past 30 years. And on the other hand, we need to control our borders. So it's not easy at all to find the right approach to that.
Do you think, can I just interrupt you just for a moment there? You talk about the Stop the Boat singing, of course. I imagine you're referring to Tony Abbott's speech in London, the Thatcher lecture, in which he more or less suggested that Europe should follow the course that he set in train in Australia. Do you think those kind of calls will become more prevalent?
No, I've heard that from many other people than the previous Prime Minister. But probably, yes, there will be, some people will be tempted by drafting very simple solutions. I was talking about the National Front. The National Front is just about scapegoats. Everything that goes wrong in France is about is because of immigrants, is because of Europe, is because of Euro. But at the end of the day, they have no program. So we will have to be very careful with that. But it's true that probably among the thousands of refugees, some wolves are hidden among the sheep. And that's why we have, of course, to strengthen the controls that we can organize. But it's pretty difficult, as it was difficult for the French police or intelligence to prevent people from striking, people that were ready to die, because 7 out of 8 of these terrorists had decided that they would not survive their attack. And when the police came next to them, they just blew themselves up. So, everything is quite difficult to understand and, of course, to imagine the right reaction. So we have to be very careful about what we say about that.
All right. We're watching Q&A live from Adelaide's Thebathon Theatre. The next question, and it's one that comes back to the issue raised earlier about military intervention, comes from Peter Goon.
Thank you, Tony. Australia has some of the finest fighting men and women in the world. They can be innovative, creative, agile, adaptable, and extremely effective when they're allowed to get on and do the job. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has called for militarily defeating the self-proclaimed so-called ISIL state, Islamic State. Yet, last month, the American-led coalition forces averaged only a handful of airstrikes per day. During the 1991 Desert Storm campaign, the number of airstrikes averaged 1,200 per day, leading the USAF's retired Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, a veteran of Desert Storm, to refer to the operation in Syria as Desert Drizzle. Coalition air forces are being constrained by untenable and inappropriate rules of engagement enforced upon them by the US administration. Isn't it time our people were allowed to get on and do the job?
Andrew Macleod, I'll start with you.
I would disagree slightly, Peter, with one part of your question. If you remember back, Prime Minister David Cameron wanted the United Kingdom to be much more aggressive in Syria, and the parliamentarians in Westminster voted no. I was briefing in camera a number of politicians back then, and I said, the problem that you've got is by the time you make up your mind for a small-scale intervention, the time for the effectiveness of a small-scale intervention will go. And then by the time you make up your mind about a medium-scale intervention, the window will be closed for that, and then you're going to be left with an unholy mess that requires a large intervention. That's where we're at today. And we've now got to look at this war between us and them in a much broader context. There are the home wars that we need to have with homegrown second and third generation. There is tiny number of people that are coming in as refugees or supposed refugees with terrible effect that we saw in Paris. But then let me link your question with the previous question in an unusual way, because we always talk about refugees and asylum seekers as a threat, not an asset. Over history, militaries have spent treasure and blood to get spies behind the front lines, to understand the enemy's thinking and where they are. And we now have thousands, no, millions of people who understand ISIS, understand their theology, understand their thinking, who hate them with a passion. And we're turning our back on these people. I look at these 12,000 asylum seekers, not just as asylum seekers and refugees, but in there is the potential members of our security and intelligence forces who will tell us more about Islamic State than we've ever known before. They are the greatest assets we can have in this war, if only we start to look at them as assets. And that is a critical part of this war that we're missing. The whole intelligence place, human intelligence that we gave up on a long, long time ago. But we do need to have the discussion as France, as United Kingdom, as Australia, as United States, what actually are we wanting to do in this war? And if we're going to do it, go back to the lesson from Vietnam.
All right.
Do it properly.
Kate Ellis, do it properly. Upscale the war, if you want to put it in those terms, or, as Peter Goon has just asked, give our armed forces greater latitude to do more bombing?
I think in response to Peter's question, we have to be very careful that we stay within the legal framework that we set out for Australia's involvement. And it was very clear that that was at the request of the Iraqi government to help with their self-defence. It means that it is more complicated, our involvement, the parameters around it, and I think it is incredibly important, obviously, that Australia stays within that framework. But the other thing is, I mean, Andrew talked about the end game. What does it look like? At the moment, if you look at Syria, there is a choice between Islamic State and the Assad regime. So until we actually know what the solution, what the long-term plan is, and that needs a political solution, no military solution on its own is going to deliver the peace that we need here. The other thing that I would say that we haven't touched on, but is incredibly important if we're talking about long-term peace and we're talking about long-term stability in Syria, and that is that we also acknowledge the extent of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and that we make sure that those countries of first asylum are equipped with the shelter and the food that they need for the now millions of people who are fleeing. It strikes me as odd that the very same people that would jump up and down with the Stop the Boat slogans in our community are the people that say, why are you putting my taxpayer dollars into foreign aid? We need to actually recognise there is no simplistic answer here, and it is much more complicated, and we need to have an intelligent discussion about
Okay,
how
I'm
it's
just
all
going to
linked.
quickly get Christopher, we'll come to more of that in a moment because we've got one more question on the subject. We'll go quickly to Christopher Pine. Are the Australian Air Force being constrained by what the questioner said were unrealistic rules of engagement imposed on the Australian Air Force by the United States?
Well, nothing's been imposed on the Australian Air Force by the United States. The Australian involvement contribution is quite significant. It's what we can afford to do. I think Kate is right. Australia operates within the legal parameters that a country like Australia should operate within. We aren't going to behave like cowboys in the Middle East. We were very effective in the first and second Iraq wars, working with our allies. That's where Australia works best, and we are working very well now in Iraq and Syria, and will continue to do so. If we are asked to increase our involvement, then the National Security Committee of the Cabinet and the Cabinet will discuss that and make a decision. France today showed what can be done when they acted to attack Raqqa in the way that they did, taking out a munitions depot, a headquarters and a training facility of ISIL. I heard somebody today on the radio say that Al-Qaeda had warned ISIL that if they pushed the West too far, the West would respond and destroy them, as had happened in Afghanistan to Al-Qaeda when the United States decided after September 11 that enough was enough. So I think the next few days, few weeks, few months are very, very important. Cool heads should prevail. And Malcolm Turnbull's admonition to, I think, the Australian media in a generous and soft way was, don't expect a fire-breathing response from the government. Expect a cool-headed response built around, sure, military involvement, but diplomatic involvement, political solutions, and a humanitarian solution, which Kate also alluded to.
We just heard about the French bombing in Raqqa, and I suppose the obvious question, and I'm afraid it'll require a brief answer, has France taken the gloves off when it comes to its bombing campaign?
I mean, we had to respond because what the terrorists tried to do is make us, retreat from our previous decision, our previous position. So we had to retaliate, and probably this will happen again in the coming times. But as you said, I mean, there's no military solution, so we're also working, and most of the G20 has been working on that issue, how to find the right political evolution, the right political solution in Syria.
And we have a question on that. It's from Bassem Daly. It'll be the final question on this topic.
The West don't seem to have learned anything from the last 20 plus years, where the doctrine of democracy export through military intervention seems to have prevailed. The state of affairs as a consequence of that is what we see today in in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. Isn't it time that we rethink what we do and that we approach these conflicts through a different doctrine of negotiation, like we did with the issue of nuclear Iran?
Do you mean, can I just interrupt you there, Bassam, do you mean rethink the idea or the concept of regime change, and particularly in Syria? In this
That's
case?
right. In the pretext of national interest, these Western governments give themselves the right to go and interfere militarily, either directly or indirectly, in the affairs of these states. And when these states are and failed states, these type of radical groups seems to find safe havens for them to grow, and we eventually will suffer from it. I would put that actually the way we should approach these things is more in a negotiating tactic to prevent it from happening. After 5 years in Syria, we're now saying there's no military solution. Perhaps there was never one from the first place. And all the death and destruction.
I'll have to let the panel engage with that question. So we'll start with Nick Xenophon, who raised this at the beginning.
Well, I agree with Christopher Pyne that the first Iraq War, that was in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. That was a necessary response. I disagree with Christopher. I think the second Iraq War was a mistake in terms of our involvement. France actually voted against it, I think. Is that right, yes. Christophe? They voted against it.
Strongly opposed.
And you were France was strongly opposed to it. We're now in a mess. You're right, we need to reconsider. We have to do something differently. It needs to be a political solution. I think what Malcolm Turnbull said is encouraging. But the worst thing we can do is to have a massive bombing campaign that leads to civilian casualties, because then ISIS will recruit hundreds, if not thousands, more recruits. We need to embrace real Muslims and fight it, but we have to do something differently.
So, Nick Xenophon, does that mean if regime change is out of order from the way you look at it, should the regime in Syria remain in power, that is, the dictator Assad? Is that the best way to deal with this
Sometimes you have to do well, or a political solution where Assad's power is clipped significantly, and I think that's what the West is looking at, the G20 is looking at. But what we are doing now, it has not worked. As brutal and as bad as Saddam Hussein was, it seems that it was replaced with almost a greater evil in terms of the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost. We need to avoid the same mistakes.
Holly Ransom, can you imagine the West contemplating, basically, particularly the United States, switching positions and backing President Assad to stay in power as a way of defeating ISIS?
Look, I think one of the things we're expecting to see come out of the G20 in the next 24 hours will be not only part of the early stage of the political solution or the military approach, though I'm sure the language will keep it vague as to exactly how that will play out, but also in part the global humanitarian response and how everyone will play a role in that. I think the thing is, and it's actually an undertow that's run through a lot of the questions tonight, there is a need for new leadership, there is a need for new thinking, both in how we empower, to Mohammed's question, how do we bring new advocates out, how do we facilitate a different conversation, right to what Bassam was talking about there around how do we make sure we're not persisting with an approach that we've continued to see fall short and fail to create the outcomes that we're wanting. So while you don't see an about turn coming overnight by any stretch, you hope that we can come back to the table and rethink the manner in which we're going about engaging. And I wouldn't say the US will change its foreign policy by any stretch overnight, but that a global solution can start to look at new alternatives.
Christophe Lecourtier, the US bottom line for some time has been that there can be no peace plan for Syria if Assad remains part of it. Does France think that is the wrong approach?
No, we still believe that Assad cannot be part of a final and stable solution.
An interim solution, which is, I guess, the position Australia has adopted?
At least at that stage, what we've seen, and that's one of the very few good consequences of the Paris attacks, is a direct discussion between President Obama and President Putin for the first time in so many months. And apparently they've agreed on a first round of, to define what could be this political solution, and at the end of it, Assad would have to leave. And France will not be supporting any solution that would leave Assad in its capital, because we do believe that is part of the problem since the very beginning, and
that'll put you at loggerheads with Russia automatically and with Iran, who both want to keep Assad in power.
Then it's probably a question of schedule and of doing that, implementing that step by step, and it's a matter of diplomats, as you imagine.
Andrew, is anyone that diplomatic to get Russia and Iran to agree that Assad must go eventually?
Maybe eventually. I mean, the thing about foreign affairs is and leadership in foreign affairs is almost always not a choice between a good option and a bad option. You don't need leadership in a good option and a bad option. You pick the good one. What we see in Syria, as we saw in Iraq, because there are debates on both sides, Nick, about would Iraq have been better with Saddam Hussein in place still butchering hundreds of thousands of people? There are arguments on both sides. And what we've got in Syria now is a balance of bad options. Do we leave Assad in power? Do we re-empower the Russians in their foreign policy? Do we go in and bomb the heck out of it? I mean, each of those options is a bad option, and the challenge for our leaders is to steer the way and find the least bad of bad options. When I said earlier, Tony, that if you're going to do it properly, I didn't mean just militarily. I meant the whole spectrum. And the big mistake in Iraq, in my view, isn't they intervened. The big mistake in Iraq was there was no plan for the recovery and the reconstruction. And the data is clear. If you don't get economic growth in a failed and fragile state, it will descend back into conflict every time. And as strange as it may seem, there was no discussion between military and political planners with the private sector to talk about how do you actually get the economy going again? How do you actually give back to communities something they will lose, i.e. jobs and economic prosperity, if they go back to war? So if we were to do something in Syria and we were to do it properly in my view means reconstruction, recovery, understanding the communities, know how to build civil societies back in countries post-conflict, none of those things were done in Iraq.
Christopher Pyne, I'll bring you in for the final word on this. Julie Bishop warned that getting rid of Assad could leave a power vacuum in Damascus. That means, I presume, that our government at least is considering leaving him in place for a period of time or advocating that he remain in place.
I think Christophe put it very well when he said that it's all a matter of schedule. All Western governments believe that the Assad regime should be replaced. It's a question of when that might happen. Now, for those people who are calling for the regime to instantly be changed, I'd be fascinated what their view was about Saddam Hussein, about Muammar Gaddafi, about Egypt. I mean, the West has to plan post the regime change, what's going to happen. That's something, as Bassam, I think, asked the original question. We've been quite determined to replace appalling regimes. From Saddam Hussein to Muammar Gaddafi. I don't think we've planned the post period well. And in Iraq, we removed all of the administrators and public servants who'd been associated with the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein, the Ba'ath Party. They were the people that could have run the country. They weren't necessarily all mad as Saddam Hussein advocates. Most of them would have been fearing for their lives, I assume. And yet they were all removed instantly. It's a good example of where we got it wrong and where we need to get things right in the future.
I'm going to move along, and we are here in South Australia. The subjects we would have been talking about will come up now for the little time we've got left. We've got a question. We actually have had regime change of a kind in Australia quite recently. The next question relates to that. It comes from Amelia Romaldi.
Hi, so our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has recently been in Berlin, and that's a city that's economy is thriving because of an influx of start-up businesses, like small businesses. When you consider our state, we have such a high, like the highest unemployment rate in the country, and obviously our economy is suffering because of that. What more can our government do to help people undertake these type of small business ventures in our state to improve our economy?
I'll start with Holly Ransom.
Great question, Amelia, and it's something that a lot of young South Australians are talking to me about. Unfortunately, South Australia has the highest youth unemployment rate at the moment, and they want to be able to not just pursue job opportunities of any kind, but also to take up the opportunity to start your own business is really important. I think there's a lot of hope coming from young people right around the country in the language shift and the narrative shift in the Turnbull government, and the fact that we're talking now about an innovation agenda, and that we're going to see in December the Minister announce the plan for how it is nationally that we can take a coordinated approach to really a thriving entrepreneurship and incubator system that can allow young people and people of all ages right around the country to start up their businesses. Now, key to that's going to be a couple of things. We've got to look at tax reform and a coordinated approach to that, everything from the IP side of it through to how do we incentivise more investment in startups, incubators and accelerators. We also need to look at how we improve the way that we're educating our young people. You know, it's really alarming to look at the data on education and see that 60% of what we're skilling and what young people are studying right now will be subject to enormous disruption within the next 2 decades. So this skills mismatch that we've got going on, we're not skilling a generation for uncertainty, we're not skilling young people to be able to take up those sorts of opportunities. So in part, we've got a conversation on how do we set the economic settings to allow business to start up and thrive, and in part, how do we complement that with how we educate young people through the schooling system and better support commercialisation within the tertiary sector.
I'll bring the Minister for Innovation in a moment. I just want to hear quickly from Kate Ellis. Is the Labor Party on board with Malcolm Turnbull's Innovation Nation?
Well, I think Malcolm Turnbull jumped on board after we had already announced a number of policies in this area, which I'm happy to use this opportunity to outline.
Yes, he needed Labor to be prodding him. He didn't know anything about innovation and IT.
Well, he stood by and watched as how many $1 billion were ripped down of the R&D budget. Anyway,
he knows about innovation.
We have announced policy both in terms of the startup package, the innovation investment partnership, so that we can work together for investment. But I'll actually go to Holly's point. It's not just about having startup policies, as important as these are, and it's also about making sure that we do have the skills coming out of our schools that we need. Now, we see that 75% of the fastest growing jobs are expected to require science, technology, engineering and maths. Yet we don't have our graduates coming through, and we have a startling number of teachers in our secondary school who are teaching IT or teaching science without having tertiary qualifications in that area themselves. We've been out on the front foot. Bill Shorten has announced policies in
Got a
all
Labor
of these
government
areas.
here. Maybe you should be speaking to them.
Well, and working with the state Labor government as well. But of course, I mean, we're talking about the skills that are taught in our schools under a national curriculum. We also know that it's really important that in the budget reply, when Bill Shorten announced every child will have the opportunity to learn coding, there's a lot of people of my age or older that kind of went, what does that mean? What is that all of that about? But when you have a look at what skills will be required for people that are in school today to gain employment tomorrow and into the future, we know that this will be as important as a number of the basic subjects that we were taught when we were at school. So it is about making sure that we've got governments that are prepared now to put the policies in place to match our skills that are coming out of our education system with the jobs of the future, and we don't have much time to spare at all.
Okay, Christopher Pyne, Minister for Innovation. We just heard a little bit about what's coming. Now it's your turn.
Well, I'm not sure how much time is left, but in the short time that is available, I'm very positive. I mean, it's been a very sober night on Q&A, and you'd expect it to be, given the events over the weekend. But I am very optimistic and positive about the innovation agenda. Malcolm Turnbull is instinctively and reflexively fascinated and energised by the possibilities of the new economy to replace jobs from the old economy and to be a powerhouse of Australia. We have the skills and the intelligence and the sophistication as a nation and the universities. So in December we will hand down a national innovation and science agenda. It'll address things about the commercialisation of research. It'll address capital raising, talents and skills, government as an exemplar, I am the minister responsible. I can tell you it's very comprehensive. It is not a savings measure. It will cost money. It's a very important investment in the future. It has the capacity to be a real game changer for our economy, and I think it'll make a big difference. There's no reason at all why Australia can't be talked about in the same vein as Silicon Valley, Israel, Berlin, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, when people talk about high technology, advanced manufacturing, jobs of the new economy. And so I think it's going to be a very exciting time. And South Australia, with accelerators and incubators and 3 great universities and the Waite Institute and so much more here, can really get on board and not be negative about our future, but be incredibly positive about it, because I think the world is our oyster.
Very quick follow-up, Christopher. New generation of submarines, part of the new economy, the old economy.
Well, some of the important things that are handing down. Well, I hope you enthusiastically applaud for me when the final decisions are being announced in the coming months. But there'll
de facto Minister for Defence.
I'm a very proud South Australian. My cabinet colleagues will tell you I'm working very hard to deliver a maximum build and a maximum number of submarines for South Australia. It is one project amongst many. We already have been awarded the Future Frigates program, $43 billion. What's vitally important is that where these submarines are built, high-tech and advanced manufacturing industries follow. So for my great state of South Australia, submarines being built here will lead to jobs and it will lead to growth. There's a defence industry policy statement coming, a defence white paper, and the National Innovation and Science Agenda, followed by a budget. I think the next 6 months are very exciting, and I think South Australians will be very pleased.
It'll be particularly exciting if there's an election within them. And there's one last question on that subject, and it's from
on that one.
Hala Abakamel.
Hi, I'm a constituent from the electorate of Sturt, Mr Pine. As you're aware, a poll in July of approximately 740 Sturt residents, which was commissioned by the CFMEU, found that a majority of people would vote for a candidate backed by Nick Xenophon. Are you worried at all about losing your seat in the upcoming election?
If you don't deliver the submarines.
I don't put any store by Reach-Tel polls at all. I think they are basically a waste of the people's money who are paying for them. I think face-to-face polls are much more meaningful, or proper telephone polls conducted by agencies. The environment in July is very different to the environment of today, and it'll be very different to the environment in 12 months' time when an election is due. And I'll put myself forward to the electors of Sturt, as I have for the last 22 years, and I hope that they'll re-elect me. I've worked very hard as a cabinet minister and as a local member for them and for you, and whether Nick Xenophon's candidate attracts a large number of votes, the important thing to remember is that we've had experiments with personality-based political parties. Clive Palmer, Pauline Hanson, Nick Xenophon.
Nick Xenophon.
Don't risk it.
Nick Xenophon.
Don't take the risk.
I'm going to give you the final word here, because I think you possibly after that...
more Clive Palmer parties springing up in the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'm worried about. I'll tell you what keeps me awake at night. We are facing 200,000 jobs that we lost in this country at the end of 2017 when car making finishes in this country. We need to act immediately. We need to act with a real sense of urgency in relation to that. Today I spoke to 2 companies that believe that they can revive car making in this country in terms of a local build, local investment, and I know Christopher's been speaking to one of them, which is terrific. We need to, rather than bury the car industry, we need to look at its revival and renaissance, because as a nation we can't afford to let it go.
And I can't leave. Just you need to follow up on that question there.
Well, democracy is a beautiful thing.
Are you going to throw a candidate up against Christopher Pine in Sturt?
We're not going to throw them up. It'll be very strategic decisions. So it'll be a great contest.
I hope that I've got the same way as Anne Bressington and Bob Moran.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. All right, we might leave those two with their face-to-face polling. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Andrew Macleod, Kate Ellis, Christophe Lecourtier. Holly Ransom, Christopher Pine and Nick Xenophon. Thank you. And special thanks to Adelaide's magnificent Theberton, I beg your pardon, Theatre. Theberton Theatre.
You could call it the Theberton.
And there's great audience in the Theberton Theatre, so please give yourselves a huge round of applause.
Here, well done.
Okay. Next Monday is our final Q&A for 2015. We'll be joined by Environment and Climate Minister Greg Hunt, Shadow Infrastructure Minister Anthony Albanese, acclaimed novelist and former Middle East correspondent Geraldine Brooks, the former Finance Minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, and businesswoman and economist Judith Sloan. So until next week's Q&A, good night.